continue our look at cold case Christianity on Blessed Man Meditations, J. Warner Wallace's landmark book that made him famous, how he, a former atheist, became a Christian by examining the evidence, not in spite of the evidence. And this is the story of him, a homicide detective investigating the claims of the Gospels. He's a cold case homicide detective, Christian case maker, and adjunct professor of Christian apologetics at Biola University. Wallace's cases have been featured on numerous TV programs and channels, including Dateline, Fox News, and Court TV. Wallace is a recipient of the Police and Fire Medal of Valor Sustained Superiority Award and has a master's degree in theological studies. He was a vocal atheist for many years. He now uses his investigative skills to make a case for Christianity. He lives with his family, his wife Susie, and 4 children in Southern California. So last time we did the preface, today we're doing Chapter 1, Don't Be a Know-It-All, and Resisting the Influence of Dangerous Presuppositions. And that's what materialism comes from. It comes from the presupposition of the non-existence of the spiritual realm. And it is a dangerous presupposition because it actually makes a person closed-minded to many possibilities. So in this chapter, we're going to discuss the principle of not being a know-it-all. Don't be a know-it-all. The chapter begins with Wallace recounting the first homicide he worked after working robberies for many years. He worked this homicide with an experienced homicide detective. In the book, Wallace explains that the detective looked at evidence with bias. And looking at the evidence with bias prevented the detective from properly interpreting the evidence he saw. When it comes to certain historical evidence, presuppositions can also affect how the historical evidence gets interpreted by those investigating it. The book makes the point that presuppositions color the way we see evidence. One's philosophy, their presuppositional underpinnings, can hurt their methodology because their philosophy can affect how they do things. It's important to look at evidence objectively and actually follow evidence where it leads. Many people like to talk about following evidence where it leads, but not everybody does that because they fail to look at evidence objectively. They have bias. Sometimes the evidence following where it leads can make us uncomfortable. All of us have presuppositions that impact how we see the world around us. It's important to enter any new investigation with open eyes to any possibility. We should not bite on any philosophy or theory until the evidence undergirding it shows it to be rational and evidential. That's the thing that a lot of non-believers fail to see about Christians who are believers because of the evidence, not in spite of the evidence. The Christians don't just believe anything they hear. They believe because of the evidence, because it is rational, and because it is evidential to believe it. We simply cannot enter any investigation with a philosophy that dictates the outcome. That's what many materialists do. Their materialistic philosophy eliminates them from accepting any non-materialistic explanations for why things are the way they are. But to be good detectives, to be good evidence studiers, we simply cannot enter any investigation with a philosophy that dictates the outcome. We must be objective. Objectivity is paramount. Objectivity is the first principle of detective work. Our presuppositions are sometimes hidden in a way that makes them hard to uncover and recognize. We can't tell that we have presuppositional biases all the time that prevent us from seeing things the way we should see them. We can't always tell that's the case with us, and it makes us uncomfortable to hear when somebody points it out to us that we have presuppositional biases that prevent us from seeing things how they are truly. So, we have spiritual presuppositions. As an atheist, many presuppositions tainted the way Wallace investigated the claims of Christianity. Raised by an atheist father, Wallace was convinced by the growing secular culture that science would eventually explain all of life's mysteries. And you hear many skeptics talk in a similar way, that science has all the answers, and just because science hasn't figured it out, one day it will. That's what they call the theory of everything, that they're working on the theory of everything. Wallace was committed to the notion that they would ultimately find a natural answer for everything we once thought to be supernatural. His early career as a homicide detective further amplified these materialistic presuppositions. If he came to a different conclusion than those with materialistic presuppositions, those with the materialistic presuppositions would think he was crazy from having a different opinion than him. All homicide investigators obviously presumed that supernatural beings are not reasonable suspects, and many detectives reject the supernatural altogether. Obviously, it's not necessary to posit supernatural first in investigating causes for things. It's not always necessary to posit the supernatural first. Detectives have to work in the real world, the natural world of material cause and effect. Detectives presuppose a natural philosophy as they begin to investigate causes. Philosophical naturalism or philosophical materialism is the philosophy that detectives presuppose when they begin to investigate cases. This philosophical naturalism rejects the existence of supernatural agents, powers, beings, or realities. It begins with the foundational premise that natural laws and forces alone can account for every phenomenon under investigation, and that's what science, atheistic science, wants you to believe today. That the natural laws are sufficient, natural laws and forces are sufficient to explain why things happen the way they do. But what's funny is, in our repeated experience, laws come from lawgivers. And people don't want to make that connection when it comes to these natural laws, that even the natural laws have a lawgiver. Philosophical naturalism rejects the existence of supernatural agents, powers, beings, or realities. Philosophical naturalism begins with the foundational premise that natural laws and forces alone can account for every phenomenon under examination. That you don't need to invoke anything supernatural to attempt to explain something that happens. If there's an answer to be discovered, philosophical naturalism dictates that we must find it by examining the relationship between material objects and natural forces. That's it, nothing more. Supernatural forces are excluded by definition. God isn't even allowed a seat at the table. Most scientists begin with this presupposition and fail to consider any answer that's not strictly physical, material, or natural. They won't even look at it. And it doesn't occur to them that it's possible that there never will be a natural explanation for some things, because those answers are not meant to be found because they don't exist in the natural dimension. Even when a particular phenomenon cannot be explained by any natural material process or set of forces, the vast majority of scientists will refuse to consider a supernatural explanation. Richard Lewontin, an evolutionary biologist and geneticist, once famously wrote a review of a book by Carl Sagan and admitted that science is skewed to ignore any supernatural explanation, even when the evidence might indicate that natural material explanations are lacking. Here's this review by Lewontin. Quote, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs." So he says even some of the things that science asserts are absurd. In spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we've made a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. So their prior commitment forces them to come to certain conclusions that go contrary to what the evidence suggests. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. So, again, they won't let a divine foot in the door. And it's because they won't let a divine foot in the door, because they have materialist presuppositions, that they reject many types of evidence, that they reject explanations that are more commonsensical than some of the things that they come up with. I mean, they'll even, some of them will even go to the extent of positing aliens as opposed to a supernatural entity. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door, and that sums it up beautifully, that they can't allow a divine foot in the door, because then they would have to admit that the theists have a stake in the discussion, and if they can eliminate the theists from the discussion, then they can have the monopoly in the schools, and they can have the monopoly in the mental real estate in people's minds. Scientists aren't alone. Many historians are also committed to naturalistic presupposition. The majority of historical scholars, for example, accept the historicity of the New Testament Gospels insofar as they describe the life and teaching of Jesus and the condition of the first century environment in which Jesus lived and ministered. Many of these same historians simultaneously reject the historicity of any of the miracles described in the New Testament, in spite of the fact that these miracles are described alongside the events that scholars accept as historical. Why do they accept some events and reject others? I believe, was it Thomas Jefferson? One president rejected them. He basically cut out all the miracles and accepted everything else as historical because they have a presuppositional bias against the supernatural. That's why some accept some events and reject others. That's why many scholars accept some events and reject others, because they have a bias against the supernatural. One such famous skeptic, former pastor, former professing Christian, Bart Ehrman, former famous agnostic professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, was once in a radio debate with Mike Licona, research professor of New Testament at Southern Evangelical Seminary, on the Unbelievable radio program by Justin Brierley. While debating the evidence for the resurrection, Ehrman revealed a naturalistic presupposition that is common to many historians. Ehrman said, quote, "The bottom line, I think, is one we haven't even talked about, which is whether there can be such a thing as historical evidence for a miracle. And I think the answer is a clear no. And I think virtually all historians agree with me on that. Sure, all historians that reject that reject the spiritual dimension, all historians that are committed philosophically to a purely materialistic explanation of things, will reject the idea that a miracle is possible, and will reject the possibility of miracles as a form of evidence, even if there is even contemporary documentation of miracles being recorded, such as the book written by Craig Keener called Miracles. Ehrman is a former Christian pastor who rejects the truths of Christianity, is now an agnostic, and teaches some sort of a Bible class in Chapel Hill. Ehrman rejects the idea that any historical evidence could demonstrate a miracle because, in his words, it's invoking something outside our natural experience to explain what happened in the past. So again, he's rejecting the possibility of something supernatural because his philosophical commitment to naturalistic materialism prevents him from doing so. It shouldn't surprise us that Ehrman rejects the resurrection given his presupposition. He arrived at a particular natural conclusion because he would not allow himself any other option, even though the evidence might be better explained by the very thing he rejects. So we have certain mental roadblocks that can prevent us from seeing evidence as we should. Wallace began to understand the hazard of philosophical presuppositions when working as a homicide detective. At a crime scene, Wallace and his partner were discussing who murdered a particular female victim. One had a mental roadblock and presupposition that the spouse was the perpetrator before looking at much of any of the evidence. They were already talking about the spouse before they had even begun to examine the evidence for this particular crime. And that's unfair. It creates bias against the spouse and prevents one from looking at the evidence or the spouse in an objective fashion. It would prevent the spouse from being viewed in an objective light. And similarly, many skeptics, atheists, fail to look at the evidence for Christianity's truth, for God's existence objectively, and therefore they create a roadblock for themselves to belief, to coming to Christ, to believing that God even exists. So when Wallace was an atheist, he did the very same thing. He stood in front of the evidence of God, interested in answering the question, does God exist? But he began the investigation as a naturalist with the presuppositions that nothing exists beyond the natural laws, forces, and material objects. He was asking the question, does a supernatural being exist, after first excluding the possibility of anything supernatural? That's circular reasoning. He's saying, he's asking, does a supernatural being exist, while coming to the a priori conclusion, while even asking the question that it's impossible that a supernatural being exists, because that just doesn't happen. That's what many skeptics, atheists do today. They reject the possibility of anything supernatural because their a priori default viewpoint is that that's not possible. They close themselves off to the evidence because their philosophical starting point is that it's not possible that the evidence could point to something supernatural. So it becomes impossible to have conversations with them, fruitful conversations with them, because they close themselves off to the evidence. And there's lots of reasons why people can do that. Some of them may have been hurt in religious situations, church situations. They may have been hurt by a believing family member, and it can cause them to be shut off from seeing the evidence as they should, hearing the evidence as they should, and believing it. Obviously, Wallace came to the conclusion that no supernatural being existed because he had already decided against God's existence, because his presuppositions ruled out the existence of anything beyond natural laws, forces, and material objects. And that's what many skeptics do today. They reject the proposition that God exists because their mind is already made up against it because of bias. This is the truest definition of bias, because he started with his mind already made up when he said that no supernatural being exists. So when we smuggle our conclusions into our investigation by beginning with our conclusions as the initial premise, we're likely to beg the question and end up with conclusions that match our presuppositions rather than conclusions that reflect the truth of the matter. So we should enter this investigation of whether or not God exists, whether or not Christianity is true, with empty hands. Ironically, it's often the Christians that are accused of being biased simply because they believe in the supernatural. This accusation has power in our current pluralistic culture. Biased people are seen as prejudicial and unfair, arrogant and overly confident in their position. And what's ironic is when you hear many of the atheists on YouTube talking today, they're the ones who sound prejudicial and unfair, because they're the ones who are prejudicial and against letting a divine foot in the door, and treat the evidence that the Christians bring to them unfairly. And they speak arrogantly and overly confident in their position, because if they can belittle the Christian and sound knowledgeable themselves, then they can discredit the Christian and get people to stop listening to the Christians. But Christians need to be careful not to be arrogant and overconfident in their position either, because they want people to hear them and receive Christ. So they need to be careful to do their Christian case making with humility. Nobody wants to be identified as someone who's biased or opinionated, but make no mistake about it. All of us have a point of view. All of us hold opinions and ideas that color the way we see the world. Anyone who tells you that he or she's completely objective and devoid of presuppositions has another more important problem. That person's astonishingly naive or a liar. So we have some dangerous presuppositions for jurors and some dangerous presuppositions for truth seekers. Examples of dangerous presuppositions for jurors as they begin to enter their time serving on a case. This would be an example of non-objective presuppositions that people with small, bright, beady eyes are suspicious. That's just a stupid conclusion to come to, just because of someone's physical appearance, that they must be suspicious. People of a certain race would never commit a particular crime. Well, that's biased as well. It's prejudicial as well. And another dangerous presupposition for a juror is that police officers are liars and untrustworthy. Maybe some of them are, but that doesn't mean that all of them are. That's a dangerous presupposition for a juror to enter a case with. Likewise, there are dangerous presuppositions for people seeking the truth. One such dangerous presupposition is that nothing exists outside the natural realm, which is the default presupposition of atheist materialists. Another dangerous presupposition for truth seekers is that if it can't be tested with my five senses, it doesn't exist. Well, the tests for God's existence can't be done with the five senses, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. Of course, that's a presupposition of scientism, of materialism, scientific materialism. And the other dangerous presupposition for truth seekers is that supernatural explanations must be avoided. That's because of bias. They come to those conclusions that supernatural explanations must be avoided, and that science is the only way to knowledge, is the only way to truth. I heard there's an old clip of William Lane Craig and Peter Atkins having a discussion, and Atkins, the atheist, basically says that science can't explain everything. And then William Lane Craig rebuts that and gives several examples of things that science cannot explain. And Atkins just sits there in stunned silence. So the question is not whether we can have ideas, opinions, or pre-existing points of view. The question is whether or not we will allow these perspectives to prevent us from examining evidence objectively. And many times our pre-existing ideas, opinions, or points of view do cause us to not be able to examine evidence objectively. It's possible to have a prior opinion, yet leave this presupposition at the door in order to examine evidence fairly. And that's if we're going to examine evidence fairly and properly, we've got to leave our opinions at the door. We ask jurors to do this all the time. So if a juror can be expected to do it, maybe not all of them can, but some of them surely can. And if jurors can do this, why can't we do this? If jurors can examine evidence objectively and arrive at an accurate verdict in a trial, why can't we investigate the evidence for Christianity objectively and arrive at the correct verdict? In the state of California, jurors are repeatedly instructed to keep an open mind throughout the trial and not to let bias, sympathy, prejudice, or public opinion influence their decision. Courts assume that people have biases, hold sympathies and prejudices, and are aware of public opinion. In spite of this, jurors are required to keep an open mind. So why can't those investigating the truth of theism, the truth of Christianity, investigate the evidence with an open mind? I think if they did, more of them would arrive at the conclusion that theism is true, that Christianity is true, if they could investigate it with an open mind. Jurors have to enter the courtroom with empty hands. They must leave all their baggage in the hall. Everyone begins with a collection of biases. We must, to the best of our ability, resist the temptation to allow our biases to eliminate certain forms of evidence, and therefore certain conclusions, before we even begin the investigation. But if we start with the presupposition that the only thing that exists is observable in the material world, we will shut ourselves off from being able to reach certain conclusions. We will shut ourselves off from receiving the validity of certain types of evidence. As a skeptic, Wallace was slow to accept even the slightest possibility that miracles were possible. His commitment to naturalism prevented him from considering such nonsense, and this is the true of many skeptics today. Many people won't even accept the possibility that miracles are possible, even if there are plenty of examples with eyewitness testimony. So then they'll say, well, eyewitness testimony is a you can't trust eyewitness testimony. Okay, but yet police departments do that in criminal cases all the time. They make their cases based on eyewitness testimony because eyewitness testimony is all that is available for certain types of crimes. So Wallace's commitment to naturalism prevented him from considering the possibility that miracles happen. But after his experience with presuppositions at the crime scene, Wallace decided he needed to be fair with his naturalistic inclinations. If more committed atheists could be fair with their naturalistic inclinations, they may be able to view the evidence for God's existence and for Christianity's validity with more of an open mind. And perhaps more of them might be persuaded to turn from their atheism to Christianity, like happened for Wallace. Wallace couldn't begin with his conclusion that the material universe is all there is and that God does not exist and that Christianity can't be true if the evidence pointed to the reasonable existence of God. This certainly opened up the possibility of the miraculous. And as I try to show on this channel and many others try to show, the evidence does point to the existence of a creator, to the existence of the miraculous. Okay, so if God did exist, God's the creator of everything we see in the universe. God therefore created matter from non-matter, life from non-life, and created all time and space. God's creation of the universe would certainly be nothing short of miraculous. If there was a God who could account for the beginning of the universe, lesser miracles, say Jesus walking on water or healing the blind, might not even be all that impressive. Jesus was going to learn if Wallace was going to learn the truth about the existence of a miraculous God, he needed to stay to at least lay down his presuppositions about the miraculous. He had to stop shutting out the possibility of the miraculous. And if skeptics can today shut out can accept that it's possible for a spiritual dimension that exists, if they can accept the possibility that there might be a God, that science can't explain certain things, that in the areas that science cannot offer insight, that within that realm that there might be a God, they might be able to understand some things that they didn't previously understand. Imagine a circle, and the circle is a symbol for 100% of all the knowledge in the world, all of the knowledge of everything. And suppose you know 1% all the knowledge in all the universe. None of us do. None of us know that much. But let's say you know 1% of all the possible knowledge in the world. Don't you think that it's possible in that 99% that you don't know, that there's a possibility that God might exist? If so, then you have to be willing to call yourself an agnostic, not an atheist. And you should be able to take a look at this evidence more objectively. So if Wallace was going to learn the truth about the existence of a miraculous God, he needed to lay down his presuppositions about the miraculous. He needed to open his mind up that it might be possible. His experience at crime scenes has helped him to do just that. That doesn't mean he's quick to rush to supernatural explanations every time he fails to find a quick, easy, natural explanation. It simply means he's open to following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it points to the existence of a miraculous designer. And if more people were actually willing to follow the evidence where it leads, you might hear of more atheists becoming Christians. If people were able to follow the evidence where it leads, you might hear of more people doing what Wallace did and laying down his naturalistic armor and replacing it with the armor of God. So now let's look at Wallace's tool for the call-out bag, a tip for the checklist. Wallace keeps a leather bag packed beside his bed that contains all the gear he needs when he's called to a homicide scene in the middle of the night. Wallace's call-out bag typically includes a flashlight, blank notepads, plastic gloves, digital recorder, camera, and of course his gun and badge. This bag also includes an investigative checklist that he created many years ago when he was a new detective. While he seldom needs to refer to it anymore, it represents years of wisdom gleaned from partners, classes, training seminars, successful investigations, and failed efforts. If you assemble your own call-out bag and checklist, you might include this first principle related to presuppositions. It will serve you well as you investigate the Gospels. Yes, if you eliminate the presupposition that only the material world exists, that only naturalistic explanations are valid explanations, then it might serve you well when you investigate the Gospels. When he was an atheist, Wallace allowed the presuppositions of naturalism to unfairly taint the way he looked at the evidence for God's existence, and many do that same thing today. Because their philosophical commitment to naturalism, they are unable to look at the evidence for God's existence objectively. Wallace failed to differentiate between science, the systematic rational examination of phenomena, and scientism, the refusal to consider anything other than natural causes. And if you listen to a lot of atheists today, they are adherents to scientism. They refuse to consider anything other than natural causes because it would cost them too much to give that up. Wallace was 35 before he recognized how unreasonable it was for him to reject the possibility of anything supernatural, before he even began to investigate the supernatural claims of Christianity. It took him a while before he matured enough to where he could humble himself to even begin to investigate it. In those days, when he encountered phenomena that could not be explained naturally, he simply dug in and continued to reject the possibility that something extranatural might be operating. He refused to begin the journey with empty hands or an open mind, and too many people do that today. They refuse to open their minds to the possibility of a supernatural dimension. They refuse to open their minds to the possibility that there just are some things that science will never be able to explain because they're not meant to be explained by science. So we have to be willing to open our minds to be able to examine evidence in a more objective fashion. Even though he's a Christian today, Wallace understands that much of the phenomena we observe can be explained satisfactorily by simple relationships between matter and the laws of nature. Yes, even if Christianity is true, just because Christianity is true, that doesn't mean that there can't ever be a natural explanation for things. Of course there can be, and many times there is. More times than not, there is. For this reason, Wallace tries to be careful not to jump to supernatural explanations when natural causes are supported evidentially and are perfectly acceptable. Not all of God's activity is overtly miraculous. God is still at work even in the interaction between the matter he created and the natural laws that reflect his nature. This is in fact miraculous enough, the fact that matter and the natural laws interact so perfectly as they do. As a result, Wallace tries to encourage his skeptical friends to re-examine their natural presuppositions, but he's careful to respect the claims of naturalists when they are evidentially supported. Sure. An honest Christian can accept much of what science says, because when science is done correctly, without that bias, then science has a lot of good things to say. So that's the end of Chapter 1 of Cold Case Christianity. From J. Warner Wallace. Next time, we're going to look at the second principle for being a detective, how to infer. So I challenge those listening to listen to the apologists for Christianity, the adherents to Christianity objectively. Listen to the evidence that they provide and do so objectively. I think if more people listen to the evidence for Christianity objectively, I think we'll hear more disciples of Christ being created. But we've got to remove our presuppositions. We've got to remove our biases. And we've got to be able to look at things with an open mind. Failing to do that is going to lead to some bad conclusions. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.